This is an episode of Unconfined, a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu. Mike Milley is our sound engineer and produced our theme music. Your hosts are me, Tom Philpott, and Christine Grillo. Paulette Wilson is a producer, and Natalie Wood-Wright is the executive producer. The opinions expressed here are not necessarily those of Johns Hopkins University or of the Center for a Livable Future.
You're listening to Unconfined, a Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future podcast. I'm Christine Grillo, and I'm here with Tom Philpott. And today we're going to start a series on animal agriculture and worker justice. And Tom is going to kick it off by telling us what happened after Upton Sinclair published The Jungle and how that kicked off some changes for workers.
Yeah, so it comes out in 1906, and Upton Sinclair, he, goes into the Chicago meatpacking yards and the places where they hold the animals, and he gets to know workers in the meatpacking plants. And he does this expose, and what he's trying to do is do an expose of working conditions. And, basically anyone who follows the meat industry it'll be very familiar what he finds. It's a largely immigrant workforce. They're very, very low paid. Safety standards are horrible. All sorts of injuries are happening on the job. So he does this expose. But what happens is, in the course of his expose, he also talks about all kinds of disgusting stuff getting into the meat, like literally people's blood from getting cut. It's just a really, really disgusting read. And he thinks that he struck this blow for worker justice. But what he really did was he struck a blow for food safety, and it sparked all of these food safety reforms. And he later lamented that, it didn't do much for worker justice, but it didn't do much for worker justice immediately. There was a long-term effect. And what he found in the decades after, in the 20s and 30s, there was this real push for organizing, labor organizing in the meatpacking plants. And the federal government under Roosevelt, under FDR, actually got behind it. And so what you got was, by the time, after World War II, we get this economic boom in the country after World War II, led by manufacturing. It was, very heavily unionized manufacturing workforce. And meatpacking workers, in the second half of the 20th century, or at least the initial decades of that period, actually became a middle-class profession. It was a proper middle-class job. And basically, meatpacking workers, we think about the post-war boom, we think about, auto workers and the strong auto union and the way that, auto workers became middle class and were able to buy houses. Meatpacking workers were in a very similar situation. And that what you get in the 80s is you get this push. There's an overall push in the economy to sort of bust unions.
Right,
and
the Reagan era.
The Reagan era to take away worker power. That's very successful, but it was extremely successful in the meatpacking world. And so, in 1983, for the first time, meatpacking worker wages fall below those of manufacturing workers. Okay. And you see this downward slope after that. There's a great Human Rights Watch report that came out in 2019 where I'm getting these numbers. In 2002, they were 15% lower than average manufacturing wages. And by 2019, they were 44% lower. So meatpacking workers it actually stopped being a middle-class profession. And so what you get is this explosion around the same time as wages fall. And as we'll hear in this series from a couple of our guests, safety standards also just sort of go out the window, and you get essentially a return of the Upton Sinclair era. You get lots and lots of immigrants coming in. You get very, very little labor power. You get sky-high injury rates. and you get this incredible depression in wages.
Right.
And that's kind of where we are right now. And then something else that happens, I think is really interesting, is that the American appetite for chicken takes off over this period. It used to be that pork and beef were more popular than chicken. Because of a lot of different changes, not just the ones we're talking about, chicken takes off in popularity. And in that period, the chicken industry, to avoid unionization, it largely takes root in the U.S. South, in places like Arkansas, where Tyson is based, in places like Alabama and Georgia, and in even Maryland. These are states where it's hard to form unions, and in fact, it's virtually impossible in places like Arkansas, Mississippi, and Georgia to form unions. And so you get this poultry workforce that has very, very little union density at this point. Beef and pork, by comparison, have a lot more union density than poultry. And so you get this immigrant workforce that with no union protections and declining wages compared to their peers in manufacturing. And as we're going to hear in this series, you get very little safety oversight.
Right. So by 2019, they're working for a lot less money than they were even 20, 30, 40 years earlier.
Yeah.
And then in 2020, what comes along is...
Yeah, so the coronavirus pandemic takes root in this industry where there are very few worker protections, where regulators are basically absent, and it absolutely steamrolls workers. And I talked to workers. I did some journalism early in the pandemic in April of 2020. I talked to workers, and the stories that you hear that I heard were just of extreme stress. I've got kids at home. Sometimes one woman I talked to had an elderly husband, and they were terrified of bringing the virus home to them, but they had little choice but to continue working. As far as, in April of 2020, they couldn't even get masks. People were using, literally, they have
PPE shortage.
They have beard guards in these facilities. If a man has a beard, he has to wear a beard guard. Women were using those as masks early. Ultimately, they got masks, but what you got was this, incredible explosion of coronavirus cases and deaths from coronavirus. And by the end of the major phase of the pandemic, the U.S. House subcommittee on the coronavirus crisis looks at it, and they just, basically documented a situation of just carnage. They look at the, top 5 biggest meatpacking firms. That's JBS, Tyson, Smithfield, and National Beef Packing. And they found that at least 59,000 workers tested positive for the virus, and 269 people died. These are incredibly high rates of infection and also death. They found that in some plants, nearly half of people got the virus. And we also know that it's a very high turnover industry because they really can't keep people under these conditions. And so there was just this incredible influx of the virus causing incredible stress and death. And they found, this committee concluded that the meatpacking companies, very explicitly, quote, prioritize profits and production over worker safety, continuing to employ practices that led to crowded facilities in which the virus spread easily. That's a quote from that report. And at the same time, profits for these companies, for this, big 5 firms, rose steadily. There's a report from the National Economic Council in 2021 that shows in 2020 and 2021, while the industry is saying, oh my God, we can't, close down plants because there's going to be shortages. We've got to keep this going. Their profits were steadily rising in those periods. In 2020, the sort of net profit for the big 5 firms was close to $8 billion, which was the highest it had been at least since 2014. And in 2021, it goes up to $12 billion. So they have pricing power. They're able to charge more for their meat while their workers are being sacrificed. They're making just huge profits. And so what you get is a situation where labor has very little power, to demand higher wages, has very little power to enforce safety standards, and capital, the companies that, these corporations that stand at the top of this business, they have all of the power.
Right. They're making tons of money and they have all the power.
Yeah. And so in this series, we're going to dig deep into this topic. And our first guest is Magali Lisoli, and she's going to talk about the grim situation, but she's also going to talk about how workers in poultry, at least, are organizing and trying to figure out a way to, grab some power in this field. And they're doing it in creative ways that we'll hear about from Magali. This is an episode of Unconfined, a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu.